ultimately, the Constitution is about power, and where it's going to be, where it's going to be distributed, what's it going to look like. And so, particularly as the Constitution began to move into its final stages, the last third of the Constitutional Convention, the issue of power became more and more considerable, and it became more subtle. When James Madison came to the convention, his desire was to take power away from the states and give it to the federal government, or to a strong central government. And that's basically, people have generally taken James Madison as the father of the Constitution. But as we're going to see, when it comes to the distribution of power, maybe not quite so much. But Madison's statement here, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls in government would be necessary. In framing government, which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed. That's a very Madisonian point of view, which is that if you let people just go out and have government, control government, if government doesn't control people, then you're going to have people voting good things for themselves, and basically stealing from everybody else. But that includes it, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So it's a kind of halfway to where we eventually end up. But certainly the idea of government being obliged to control itself is an enormous step forward from the situation we had before the American Revolution. How do you check the powers of men or people meeting in legislatures? Back in those days, they had 13, and that was hard to do. Nowadays, we have 50. And how do you keep legislatures from doing crazy things? Most people in legislatures are responsive to the local problem, or sometimes to an ideology, which doesn't happen to have any real reference to the bigger national problems, and this was supposed to be a national government. It was thought that you had to control the state legislatures, or the rights of everybody would be threatened, and of course, and also that trade and commerce and other things would not flourish if every state government could just do whatever it pleased to do. And it was felt that the states should balance the federal government. Well, I think that's pretty acceptable, but the federal government should also balance the states. And as we're going to see, at the end of the day, there's going to be a little twist on this, in which there's another factor that will have to be taken into. Fellow by the name of Gunning Bedford of Delaware, about 2/3 of the way through the convention. He's not one of our more famous founders, and nor should he be. He's not exactly a shining symbol of American intellectual thought. But nevertheless, Gunning Bedford, about 2/3 of the way through the convention, said that, basically introduced a motion that the federal government, the national government, should be able to do whatever is necessary if the states are not competent to do it, and to correct mistakes that the states should make. Well, that's lovely. It's a lovely idea, but who makes those decisions? Who decides that the states have made a mistake? It's whoever is elected. And as we've seen, if one side elects something, a certain group of actions become seen as mistakes, but if the other side elects, then a different set of actions are seen as being improper and incorrect. So, but nevertheless, Gunning Bedford reflected the views probably of the majority of delegates, which is that the states were not to be trusted. Edmund Randolph, on the other hand, immediately after Gunning Bedford spoke, basically got to his feet and said, no, this won't do. We can't give the federal government that much power, and the states are, after all, very strong and very capable and reasonably competent and all that stuff. And Edmund Randolph came from Virginia, which was perhaps the best governed of the 13 states, and certainly maybe the most proud of the 13 states. And although he had proposed a plan, thanks to James Madison, he had proposed a plan which would have created a government with a national veto over states. Nevertheless, as the convention wore on, Randolph moved steadily toward the idea that government can be too strong, and the states really aren't that bad. So it came down to this in July of 1787. First off, should the government be given what's called a general grant? And that is, should the government in general be able to govern, should the federal government, the national government, be able to, in general, govern pretty much regardless of what the states thought? And so should they have a general grant of power in which the government is as strong as it thinks it needs to be? Or do you need some kind of other, some way of restricting government? And that, of course, goes to a dispersed government. Should the powers of the federal government be listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you get to the bottom, and that's all the power the federal government has, which disperses power to the states. As the statement is made here, if it's not in the Constitution, Congress can't do it. So, two very different views. One, you've got a strong government that believes it should be able to rise to whatever necessity the people who are governing believe is necessary. And on the other hand, there's a saying, well, no, the federal government should have a very listed set of powers and not be able to go beyond those powers. And so that becomes, of course, a tremendous question that arises. And it's all sent then to the Committee of Detail. Now, by the time the Committee of Detail emerges late in July of 1787, it's mostly people who believe that the powers of government should be enumerated, should be listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. And they're going to ignore the fact that at the beginning of the convention, that the national convention, that the convention to create a national government, a true national government, had been set up mostly or predominantly to make certain that the states aren't doing crazy things and that essentially we can all function as one entity. But 4 of the 5 people who made up the Committee of Detail believed instead that the states should be able to do almost anything that's not been enumerated, listed for the federal government. So, and depending upon how you count, there are about 30 things that the federal government is specifically able to do. And so the Committee of Detail is going to report out an enumerated, a plan for an enumerated constitution in which the powers of the government are very strictly listed. And strangely enough, despite the fact that the convention had been called in the first place because we were so disorganized, and we needed to have some way of controlling all these different impulses that are running through it and get everything going in a straight line toward a common goal, there was very little dispute over the enumeration of powers. By this time, people had been considering the issue of power for so long. I mean, we're now in our third month of the convention, for so long that they began to say, maybe we need to limit the power of this federal government. Maybe we need to make it a little bit more specific so they can't just do any darn thing. Well, then there's the question of the necessary and proper clause. The necessary and proper clause basically says that the government can do whatever it needs to do in order to meet the enumerated powers, anything that's necessary to conduct its business, and proper, and nobody has a slight idea what the word proper means. Well, in the classic instance of this is a national bank, something like the Federal Reserve. is a governmental bank proper or necessary? And in a ruling in 1819, the Supreme Court decides that indeed a national bank, which appears nowhere in the U.S. Constitution, that a national bank was necessary to conduct government's business and proper. And again, nobody has the slightest idea what proper means, but there we have it. And then there is this interesting clause here. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excise. These are taxes, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. Well, what the heck does general welfare mean? General welfare could be anything. I defy you to find a place in the United States Constitution in which national parks are authorized. But under the general welfare clause, if you can pay for it, you can, up to some points, do it. Now, this is not a blank check, but it's awfully close to being a blank check for what government can do. And it was objected to at the time that under the general welfare clause, the government could stretch infinitely. And that's not quite true, but certainly, at least not quite true yet, but the general welfare clause opens up the range in which government can function. Now, could it do away with elections in the general welfare? No, it can't do that. It can't change the basic structure of government. But in terms of what government can do, if it's pursuing the general welfare, whatever the general welfare is whatever you can get a majority of votes in Congress to do. And I guess, of course, today, you might say executive orders through the president. Anything that the executive order can do, which is not in blatant violation of the Constitution, can probably be done under the general welfare clause. However, as the convention moved on, and particularly as you get into this final third of the convention, a thinker from Pennsylvania, one of the great jurists, one of the great legal minds ever in American history, someone who has been forgotten on, James Wilson begins to emerge. Wilson was from Scotland, from Fife in Scotland, which is it's just agricultural region. I grew up fairly poor, and through a series of good coincidences managed to emerge as a legal scholar and come to America, and where he becomes very, very influential. Wilson had what I would consider a very Scottish point of view in terms of the rights of people, which is that the people should be in charge. Now, Wilson was not for chaos and anarchy and all that stuff. And he believed that government should be strong enough to prevent chaos and anarchy. But he had a view which is going to take over pretty much in the third, and it's going to be a view very different than James Madison's view about the government being able to control the governed. When the convention began, it was assumed almost certainly by a majority of the delegates that government is a contract between the governors on one hand and the governed on the other. And it's a mutual, reinforcing contract. The trouble with that is it identifies some people as governed and some people as governors. Now, this isn't aristocracy and it's not monarchy, but it's saying that there are some people who govern, and then they are the ones in charge of the governed. In other words, the government has a people. Under the influence of James Wilson and others, but particularly under the influence of James Wilson, the idea was that the people should have the government, that those who governed are the servants of the people. Now, this is quite a bit different. If you go back and check, this is quite a bit different than what Madison was thinking at the beginning of the convention. but this is the view that eventually comes to dominate, which is that the people are the source of power, and those who govern are at the disposal of the people. Wilson believed that in such a situation, that if the people are actually in charge, then the people should elect as many governmental posts as possible. And that's what's going to happen. And that even with the power of appointment that the presidents have, that it still has to go before a presidential appointment, still have to go before a tribune, a panel of the governed, who are elected by the governed. And Wilson believes quite strongly that even appointments by people like the president should be overseen by people representing the servants of the people. And of course, that's what's going to happen. And that's how we end up with we the people at the top of the U.S. Constitution. Is as it's not, there's not an agreement here between the governed and the governors. Instead, it says we the people. And that we do ordain this particular document as the one we wish to have. And so that Wilson, to a very great extent, perhaps had more impact in the long run than James Madison or Alexander Hamilton, many of the great thinkers of the William Patterson, Roger Sherman. It may be that in the long run, the most influential person in the Constitutional Convention was this fellow whom you probably never heard of, by the name of James Wilson. Well, it's hard to go back and recreate this, but nevertheless, it is, I think, an important part of the Constitution that we came to this place where it's we the people, and the people have the government, and not the government have the people. So everybody take care out there. Everybody stay healthy. And in these interesting times, everybody keep their head about them. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.